Maria Coffey lost her partner on Mount Everest in 1982. In her book, Where the Mountain Casts Its Shadow, she writes about her grief and tells the stories of widows, widowers, and orphans, and the lives shattered by mountain climbing accidents. I read Where the Mountain Casts Its Shadow when I was training for my first attempt to sea kayak around Ireland. I wanted to understand what one mistake or lapse of judgment out there could cost the people who love me. I wanted to be brutally honest about whether the risks were worth taking. I approached the book as a cautionary tale and came away with a life-affirming appreciation of the outdoors and the benefits of calculated risk. Maria is also the author of more than a dozen travel books and memoirs, including my personal favorite, A Cat in a Kayak. Her most recent book, Instead, explores the decision not to have children. She and her partner Dag run Hidden Places, an adventure tours company. Welcome to Notes from a Ghost, a podcast about stories and the people who tell them. My name is Charlie, and I'm a ghostwriter. I love a good story. I hope you enjoy this one. Maria, thanks for being here.
Thanks for inviting me, Charlie. Thank you for that very kind introduction. I love that you love a cat in a kayak.
Oh, well, I love cats and I love kayaks. And
I wrote three children's books about a kayak, about a cat of ours called Tilo, who we love very much, who used to stow away in our kayak with us and then just totally got into being in the kayak. So he had some big adventures with us. So I'm really pleased that you like that story.
We've been trying to get our cat Serge out in the kayak with no luck so far. But the other day he touched the ocean. We were in swimming and he walked over and kind of put his paw in the water, which was brave for him.
He's on his way.
All right. So I want to enlist you for a little bit of like free therapy for me. Going back to Where the Mountain Casts Its Shadow, that book really hit the way few have in my life. And it I don't know quite how to put this into words, but it helped me understand why I'm so restless and why I have so much and sometimes I, I can be bordering on cruel in my contempt for things and people that I don't find exciting or interesting. Um, and I can be very black and white. But so I reading your book helped me understand that side of myself, but it also helped me understand that there is something in having adventures that allows me to give back to the people I love, and that it is a generative and positive force in my life. And it isn't just about wanting to fuck off and be alone in a kayak or take risks that like my mother would rather I not take. Can you help me untangle all of that? What's going on there? What's wrong with me?
Well, I don't think there's anything wrong with you. I mean, the world needs risk takers. I think I begin my book with something like that, and I mean, but there, there's a balance, within the whole spectrum of risk. I'm kind of interested in why you struggle with people who you think might be boring. And that's kind of a question I want to throw back at you, because what constitutes somebody who's boring to you?
Yeah, I kind of have two ways of thinking about it. At work, nobody's boring because my job is to be interested in people and interview people. And if I can't find, because I think everyone is interesting, I think people just vary in their ability to express what's interesting about themselves. However, when I come home and in my personal life, I've used the word before, like I call them like beach people, someone whose idea of a like the way they want to spend their free time is like sitting on a beach, having cocktails. And again, where I feel guilty about this is there's nothing wrong with that, like objectively, that they're not hurting anyone. But to me, like a beach is the little stretch of sand you walk across to go do something more interesting, whether it's surfing or kayaking or, and whatever. Not everybody has to have adventures. Not everybody has to be a surfer. But I feel as though my initiation into the world of having adventures and came from real struggles to accept and adjust. What's the line from The Sopranos? It's like sometimes normal life is just the ordinariness of life is too fucking much. Um, I found that really painful and challenging as a kid, and my escape was rock climbing, kayaking, surfing, swimming, and so I don't know. There's a part of me that when I find myself doing like domestic stuff or uh, dealing with people who want to go on a beach holiday, it's like I'm going to get trapped, and I need to just yeah. Anyway, that's
Yeah.
rambling.
So no, I think you've answered the question. So it's a deep fear, I think. That's the kind of the life and existence that I think for you would be death, right? It would be anathema. It would kill your spirit to live like that. And maybe, to see people like that kind of maybe that's kind of your that shadow that you dread, and therefore you don't want to be around them. And I really understand that. I mean, when I was in my 20s, I mean, as a child, I always wanted to have a big, exciting life. And I write in my new memoir instead that, my favorite book when I was a kid was Alice in Wonderland. And I wanted to be Alice. I wanted to be going to all these crazy places and shape shifting and I wanted life to be exciting and surprising and frightening, and the more I grew up, the more those kind of vague longings just became a burning desire to have kind of a big life, to go traveling, to go adventuring. And but I kind of got myself tangled up with an education, which was good. I went to university, and then I became a teacher. And I was doing my own traveling in the long summer holidays at the time. But then I became a teacher in a high school, teaching kids with learning problems and truanting kids, which was exciting in itself. But I suddenly found myself in this horror situation of a job in which every September I knew exactly what the following year was going to look like. I knew what every week was going to look like. I knew what every weekday was going to look like, every hour, because the bells went at the end of every class. And it was so structured and so predictable. I was really unhappy straight away. And I kind of relate to you, because at the time I didn't really want to hang out with the other teachers. I found them boring. I found them very sort of, they were just all settling down and starting to get married and having children. And they were also all about their careers, like how could they advance their careers? And I had this nightmare of, I literally had this nightmare of waking up, finding myself to be 65 years old, and I'd been a teacher for 40 years. And I was actually once in a school assembly quite early on, a couple of years into my teaching career, and there was a guy who had been at that school for, I think, 30 years, and he was retiring, and he was giving the last assembly. And he recounted, he'd worked out the number of times he'd walked through the school gates, the number of detentions he'd given, the number of school dinners he'd had, and in fact, it quietened the whole assembly. We all became very depressed. And for me, it was this like horror. This was the life I knew I didn't want. And I was pretty disparaging about my fellow teachers, which, looking back, I feel bad about, because, the world needs people who are prepared to do those kind of jobs. The world needs settled people as much, far more actually, than it needs risk takers. But I think that's why I was drawn to the climbing community. My brother was a mountaineer. He was a number of years older than me. And so I started through him meeting some pretty famous British climbers. and I was entranced by them, and then I kind of got drawn into their social world and would, go up to North Wales and go to all these wild parties that they were having. And back then it was mostly men in the Himalayan climbing world. And I found them really entrancing. It was like they were knights, going off to wild places and coming, really, literally touching the void, as Joe Simpson penned much later on, and staring into the void, having these life and death experiences and coming back with these amazing tales, and everything about them just seemed so alive, and the parties were wild, and they were just such fun to be around. And I didn't want to be a climber myself, and neither did I want to have a relationship with a climber, because my brother nearly died. He fell down a crevasse in Patagonia and was hauled out, freezing. And I also got to know the widows of several young climbers who died. So I kind of made the decision I didn't want to go that route. But I ended up falling in love with the mountaineer, as you mentioned in your introduction, Joe Tasker, very famous Himalayan mountaineer. And and falling madly in love with him, having a relationship with him. And he went away on 4 long expeditions in the Himalayas during our relationship, and he he didn't come back from the last one. So this is a very long, rambling way of saying, yes, I do understand. I do understand why I can see. I think it is kind of a fear of what you could become. A fear of what might trap you if you didn't follow your own dreams and passions, if you did say, oh, well, I can't do this because it's going to hurt too many people. I don't know if that goes anywhere
No,
towards an answer
that makes total sense. And as I'm thinking about how rash and mean my characterization of myself sounds, I think, and I don't want anyone who's listening to this who's in my life to think that I have contempt for you if you're not a climber or a kayaker.
Mm-hmm.
I think what I'm trying to say is I can get on with adventurers, and I can get along with people who don't have any interest in adventure and want a quieter life, and I wouldn't want a world of only adventurers and risk takers. I think where I get really mean, for lack of a better word, is when someone seems to be suggesting that I would be made happy by that kind of settled priorities that you're describing. And I think that and that comes up sometimes in like family stuff where it's just kind of like I don't know. I've never, and especially because I think they're when you're doing something that involves risking your life, it's an extra burden to know that if anything were to happen, someone who's close to you wishes you had like taken a safer path or done something that would have been that death that you're describing, that spiritual death, but would have meant that you'd be physically safe. I'd hope if
Mm-hmm.
anything ever happened to me on the water that the people who love me would know that I wouldn't have wanted to have a stroke at my desk in old age.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Um, or anxiety from doing something I hate.
Mm-hmm. And I think anybody who really does love you will understand that there is a light in you that would go out if you didn't follow your dream, your passion to be out on the water, to be taking risks. And it's interesting. I for Where the Mountain Casts its Shadow, I interviewed a lot of the world's top mountaineers, and they said a lot of very similar things. And one of the things that they talked about was, I think one of them talked about coming back from the mountain to the slow river of domestic life. That's how he described it. And he had kids, he said, it's this river of things that they just keep coming down the river, and you do one and then another one comes along and then another and then another, and it's never ending. And and it's kind of pretty much the same, and he just always longed to be out in the mountains where, and this is the other thing that everybody talked about, out in the mountains where that daily chatter that goes on in your head of all your to-do lists and things you've got to do and your domestic chores and arguments you've had with your family or your friends, or worried about your kids or whatever, all that stops. That chatter has to stop, because you have to be so focused on what you're doing, and the same for you. You're about to go on some really demanding paddle and facing some really serious elements. And I think, people talk about how dangerous climbing is, but I don't think many people understand how dangerous ocean kayaking is, because there are just so many different, and I do, because I've been out there, there are just so many things that can go so terribly wrong so fast, and in so many different ways. And I don't think people really understand just how focused you have to be, and that focus, I think, is something that I'm sure you feel like this, Charlie. That's what makes you feel really alive, and those are the moments when you are so intensely alive. And I think maybe the problem, and I can relate to this, maybe the problem then you feel with people back home is that they just don't understand that.
Yeah, and I think it's because I can't focus on anything else, and it's the only time I can focus. And I think there's a unfairness, to some extent, in that some of the people who care the most about me have never seen what I'm like in that environment.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the only, I mean, writing similar, but you do that alone too. I don't know. Like I can go to brunch, I can do what they like to do, and that's okay. I mean, that's part of what I like about it is the
Mm-hmm.
exclusivity. But yeah, it's interesting how that works. And you're right about the water. I mean, sea kayaking doesn't have anything like the death toll that climbing does, but it certainly water has this unforgiving nature that
Mm-hmm.
is unique. If you look at stories of mountain survival, there are people who did okay in the Andes in like street clothes for weeks at a time. In mild water, you're dead in 2 hours
Yeah.
without a
Mm-hmm.
wetsuit or a dry suit. And we're talking Britain, Ireland in the summer, not
Yes.
the
Not the
Arctic.
Antarctic.
So we kind of touched on this, but obviously nobody gets out of here alive. And there's no such thing as a risk-free life, no matter what you do. Um,
Mm-hmm.
But what are the risks of not taking risks? Or maybe to be more specific, not taking like the risks that you wish you would take or you would take if you were brave enough?
Well, that's an interesting question, because from a personal perspective, I have always taken the risks. Um, and I knew that if I hadn't, I don't like the word regret. Um, in my book, I use a different word, counterfactual curiosity, which is a word from psychology, which is imagining the different lives you could have led if you'd made other decisions. But I think if you don't take the risks that you wished, that you really wanted to, obviously you could end up embittered and regretful. You could end up with a life that you don't want. But I mean, the bottom line is life is a risk. It doesn't matter what you do, right? Everything you do is a risk. Every decision. You just can never, I mean, you just can never know the outcome, I think, of any decision that you make, what the outcome is going to be. And I think, it's just better to look at life as this great open-ended adventure, and yeah, so the risks of not taking risks are, well, you end up wishing you'd taken those risks and always wondering where that would have led you. And more than just being curious about it, kind of wondering it in a really sad and reflective way. The other side of not taking risks, of course, for some people, and I've explored this a lot in my work. I mean, one of my books, Explorers of the Infinite, I look at the link between extreme adventure and spiritual experience, because I think for me, always a big question, in particularly, for extreme adventurers. And for that book, I interviewed not just Himalayan climbers, but also extreme free divers, open ocean sailors, people who rowed across the Atlantic, people who kayak, huge crossings, all those sorts of things. And the big question is always, why do they do that? And I think my theory for this, and it's after my partner died on Everest, I had to really think hard about, why did he do that? Why did he make those decisions when he knew what the risks were, when he knew what the stakes were? Why did he risk breaking my heart, breaking my life into bits, which is what happened? But I guess the answer I found for myself is that everybody searches for transcendence in their life in some way. And some people can find it in meditation. Some people can find it in going to church. Some people can find it in a choir, that amazing experience, which I've never had because I can't sing, but I imagine the experience of singing together is really beautiful, playing music together. So I found it when I was younger, when I was in the depths of grief, through running. It was the only thing that got me out of my head, but I think everybody searches for transcendence. And there are some people that really, to find those moments of transcendence, they have to take way bigger risks than other people. And, so I think, you're obviously in in that category of people, who that's my theory anyway, that you have this search for transcendence, and you find it when you're out there on the ocean, really pushing, not fighting the elements, because I don't think it's a fight, but kind of working with the elements, pushing your own limits, working with your boat, using every bit of your skills and experience to get yourself through that situation safely. And then I think in moments like that, you go into a state of flow, whatever you like to call it. I like to call it transcendence. And so I guess the risk of not taking risks like that is that for you personally, you would miss that incredible experience of transcendence, which is a real human need, I think, and a longing that humans have. So,
And I think the thing that might surprise people is that you can find that in the most banal moments on a trip. And like there was after a very, very long day on the water with a friend of mine, um, it was just a tough day. And we got to a little town where we were going to camp on the outskirts of town. And um I said to him, I'm going to the shop. Do you want anything? And at first he's like, no. And then he looks up at me like with this intense look in his eyes, and he just goes, chocolate milk. And I got us each like a liter of chocolate milk, and we just sat there in silence drinking it. And like, but we had to go through that tough day
yeah.
for chocolate milk, otherwise doesn't really matter.
Yeah.
And
You were in a state of transcendence drinking that milk, and yeah, you deserved it.
if somebody is of the belief that this is all just incredibly, like, this is just a lot of words to describe selfishness, I doubt they're still listening. But like, let's talk about that light and kind of what is in it for the people in our lives as risk takers, as adventurers. Like if I'm to play devil's advocate, I mean, what's the difference between saying you want a big life and you want to be Alice in Wonderland and you want to paddle in open water, climb mountains? How is that not just garden variety grandiosity? What is going on there? Why do we admire people like Shackleton and hold a special place for those activities? What's in it for everybody else?
Because they constantly push the boundaries of what is possible for humans. And the world needs that. The world needs those risk takers. They show us what is possible. They show us how far we can go. They show us things that we can achieve. And that's the fascination. They do things that most of us won't do, wouldn't dare do. And being daring is something quite amazing. Yeah, so that's what they give us, and the world does, I mean, the world needs risk takers in every, not just in outdoor activities. It needs risk takers in literature, in science, in medicine, everything, everything. There have to be people who say, I don't care if you think this is crazy. I don't care if you think this is impossible. I'm going to do it. I'm going to try it. And they raise the bar again and again. And they allow us as human beings to evolve and to grow. And but there are casualties in all of that, of course, and it's not just, it's sort of interesting if I've often thought about that in people in different walks of life who are absolutely brilliant, like brilliant artists, brilliant writers. They're probably some of the worst brilliant scientists, some of the worst people to have as a partner or as a parent, because they're so obsessed with what they're doing, and that often comes first. But the geniuses of this world might be difficult people to live with on a personal level, but we need them. And in the risk takers of the world we're talking about, a lot of them are like shooting stars. They just burn out so fast and so young. Particularly, I mean, that I experienced that in climbing. When I was in my 20s, I lost so many friends in a short period of time, dying in the mountains. And I used to think of them like shooting stars. They were just like brilliant. And then poof, they'd burned out, they'd gone. But what a life along the way.
And what about on the kind of just interpersonal level? If you're dealing with someone who's like, well, that's great about humanity and all, but what's how about at the level of just being that person's partner or friend or parent or brother or sister? What does the light look like there, and how can
It's terrifying. I think for Where the Mountain Casts Its Shadow, as you mentioned, I interviewed the partners of many of the world's top climbers. I interviewed children of climbers who died. I interviewed parents, the hardest interviews, the only ones where I actually broke down. I managed to keep my professional facade for all of those interviews, except when I interviewed the parents of climbers. And they were really the most difficult. And next to those were the children, because in both cases, they hadn't made a choice. I mean, I made a choice to become the partner of a climber. I went into it with my eyes wide open. I knew the risks. But as a parent, you don't make that choice. And as a child, you don't make that choice. And it can be really brutal. And there can be a lot of anger. I've interviewed quite a few children, and I've seen them growing up who've had to deal with anger, because parents are supposed to be there for their children. They're supposed to protect the children. And the idea of having a child and then making the choice to go away and do something that statistically there's a pretty high rate that you might not come back, it's very hard for that child to understand. And, when they're a child and even when they grow up. Yeah. So there is a cost, and there's no way around that cost. And it's something I spent writing 3 books over 20 years, trying to come to terms with it. Even though I found I found a very happy relationship during those years, there was a lot that I was left with that it took me a very long time to process. And my therapy was writing those books and researching those books. But there's no easy way to say it. It does. People's lives are shattered, and hearts are broken, and people are left with an awful lot of things to process.
a quick aside, there's a documentary I saw on Channel 4 a few years ago. I'm blanking on his name, and we follow each other on Instagram, so I should probably know his name. But the son of Peter Bird, who is the ocean rower
All
lost at
right.
sea on the
Mm-hmm.
Pacific,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
he made a documentary about his father, and he rode with a ocean rower, an experienced guy from California to Hawaii to basically see what his similar to the Bukarev story that you shared in your book about just
Right.
seeing what did he see out there and
Mm-hmm.
what was so important that he had to deprive me of having a father.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought it was incredible. It was very raw. He broke
Mm-hmm.
down and he sort of was like wasn't having it. You know, he was incredibly he admired his dad's
Mm-hmm.
accomplishments, but he couldn't reconcile that with
Yes.
his ongoing grief as now a young man. It's powerful to watch.
Yes, I remember that. Yeah. And you know, it's there's another case, Alison Hargreaves is a British climber in the she died on K2 in the 90s. And she left two young children behind. And it was very interesting at the time because the press just eviscerated her because she was a mother leaving children behind in the way that they had certainly not attacked people like my partner, other male climbers, even climbers with children. They if they were male, they just had never mentioned the fact they were fathers most of the time. But she, after her death, I mean, it was, well, even when she was alive and climbing, there was a lot of controversy around her because she had these two little kids. And one of those children grew up to be a mountaineer, and ended up um, again trying to follow her climbs, and died in the Himalayas. But for him, he wasn't like Peter Bird's son. He didn't have that. He'd come to terms with his mother's decisions by finding that same obsession, that same love, in mountain climbing. I guess he discovered that's what made him light up in the way that it made her light up. But sadly, the mountains took him as well.
I'm going to come back to that double standard in a second. But I wanted to ask you about writing. What would be, based on your experience, what would be your advice to a memoirist writing through grief and trying to understand grief through writing?
That's an interesting question. Um, Maybe I'll just tell you my personal experience, because I had never written anything before my first book. Um, After I found out that Joe he disappeared without trace on Everest, which was doubly difficult because there was no conclusive fact of his death. There was no body to mourn over. It was just, I mean, it took me a long time to believe that he was actually dead. Thought he might just be somewhere in Tibet wandering around. And a few days after I was told that he disappeared, I started a journal, and I wrote that journal obsessively for the next 18 months. It was a receptacle for my, for all the things that I couldn't share with anyone else, particularly because, and anyone who's gone through grief will relate to this. At first, you have a lot of support and a lot of people who will listen, and inevitably those people have to draw away. They have to go back and tend to their own lives, and that's a very hard point. So at that point, my journal became the place where I poured everything into. And I kept that journal obsessively for 18 months. During that time, I went out to Everest myself and trekked up to Advanced Base Camp. And then after 18 months, it just sort of started trailing off. I made fewer and fewer entries, and then I stopped. But those journals became like totems to me. I was terrified of losing them, I think, because I don't really know why. It was, I guess, because maybe I'd lose a part of Joe, if I forgot all those very early intense feelings after I'd found out that he died. And so I used to carry them around with me. If I went away for a weekend, I'd take them with me in case the house burnt down or got burgled. I lived in inner city Manchester. And then a few years later, I moved to Canada, and I took them with me, and just stored them away in a suitcase in a cupboard. And 6 months after I got to Canada, I met the man who became my husband eventually. But 18 months after I got to Canada, we married, and it was at that point we married actually to keep me in Canada. So, we were in love, but it wasn't a big romantic thing. It was like, it was very practical, I wanted to stay there. So at that point, I thought, I'm getting married, and I've still got all these intense emotional tangles in my life because I've had a difficult relationship with Joe, and I've written about that in the journals. And I hauled them out, and I read them through. I stayed up all one night and read them. And then I decided I just had this real urge that I needed to write about going to Everest after he died, to his base camp. And what I wanted to write about was the fact that after he died, people had often, he was with another climber called Peter Boardman. They both disappeared without trace near the summit of Everest. And Peter had been married for 7 years, and he and his wife, Hillary, were trying to have children when he died. And she and I went to Everest together. But people used to say to me, it must be so much easier for you than for Hillary because you were only his girlfriend.
Whoa.
Yeah. Yeah, which
Oh
was
my
a very
God.
painful thing to say. And I wanted to write about the fact that a love cut short in its early stages can be an incredibly difficult experience, or the future, because the future's gone, the future you'd look to. So I just sat down and started writing, and it was incredible. The word catharsis always comes up, and I think, when you're going through grief, you need some outlet, you need some form of catharsis. You need to sort of take you through the experience. It could be therapy, it could be talking to people. In my case, it was writing, and writing was an enormous help. And I ended up, I wrote a 15,000 word piece. I sent it to Hillary, who'd been to Everest with me just to get her blessing. A long story short, it got passed on to a literary agent who encouraged me to carry on and write a book. And suddenly I found myself writing a book, which was a major cathartic experience, because then going to Everest was the second half of the book. My relationship with Joe was the first half. So it was a difficult process because I had to go back in time. I had to really sift through a lot of memories and details and painful stuff, but ultimately it was incredibly helpful. And so I think, I would encourage, I think writing, even though you're not writing for publication, I think writing things down it's a way of processing something in a very physical and mental way. And then you can go back and look at what you've written and rethink it all. So it's something I would encourage anyone to do. And I think, not taking on some big project, but just as I did initially, just journaling, and I'd never written a journal before. I'd never written a diary, but just every day, just basically getting out that pen and that paper, or sitting in front of your computer or your phone and just tapping out what's happening to you, and without judgment and without processing it or analyzing it, just raw, just writing down what's happening. Because, when you're in this, particularly the early stages of grief, there is such a lot happening that it's overwhelming. Yeah. So yeah, and then see what comes of it. It might just be something that, like with me, was put away in a drawer for several years. But that was such an important process for me to take that time on my own, just to sit and write what was happening, what was going through my head, the memories that I had, the regrets, the anger, all of it.
We've kind of brushed up on that double standard on a couple of topics, and there's one that you've taken on in your latest book. A woman doesn't have to climb Mount Everest to be accused of like mortal selfishness. She just has to decide that having kids is not a priority. And I to me, those two subjects are related in the sense that it seems like, for whatever reason, mountain climbing and the decision not to have children arouse this like abnormal level of hostility and accusations of selfishness from people for whom it's none of their business and it doesn't affect them in any way, but they need to speak their piece. What is going on there? Because it's just like people who don't have opinions about anything else will fly off the handle when you bring up either of those two topics for whatever reason.
Well, maybe it's the fear thing again. I don't know. It's I know. I mean, I was making that decision back in the 90s, you know, and it was a lot more people are making that decision now. But I just there was always this, you know, there was always this advice given to me that I would regret it when I was older, you know, that it was the most intense love I'd ever feel, you know, all these things were trotted out. And you know, which might be true, I don't know, but I I don't know. And even now, you know, I'm since my book was published, I've heard from and talked to so many young women and men who are going through the decision now, and there's still an awful lot of pressure, and not just from parents, but peer pressure, you know, from their friends who are having children, um, and the kind of thoughtless comments that people make. I was talking to my nephew the other day, who's getting married in the summer, and somebody said to him, "Oh, well, I suppose the next thing is you'll have a kid and move to the suburbs." He lives in central London. It was like, you know, what a strange thing to say. So I sometimes I think it's because having kids is actually really difficult. You know? And I think it does involve, I used to hate it when I was growing up. My mother used to say to me, "I sacrificed everything for you." And that was one of the many reasons I didn't want to have children, because I didn't want to sacrifice things for my kids. I wanted a big, adventurous life, and I didn't feel I could have children and do that. And in my case, it's because I had this massive fear of loss. That was one thing that Joe's death left me with. And I thought it was so hard. Well, two things, first of all. First of all, I thought it'd be so hard to lose a partner. How awful would it be to lose a child? But also, I knew that emotionally, if I had a child, I wouldn't be able to go on the kind of adventures I really wanted to go on. My husband felt differently. He thought we could have children and take them off on wild kayaking expeditions for months on end in the Solomon Islands and that, but I knew I couldn't do that. So, you know, my decisions were kind of multifaceted and complex. But sometimes I think, you know, people have kids and it is hard and they do have to give things up. And it's a huge risk having a kid. You don't know how things are going to work out. And you know, particularly in the early stages, you end up really exhausted and sleep deprived, and then you're always worried about the kids, and then you have to earn money for them. And maybe, you know, this thing about being selfish, maybe there's an envy there, you know, that somebody can be clear about, well, I don't want that. You know, it's something that, so maybe that's one part of it. And maybe to be kind, maybe for those people, it is the most intense love they've ever felt. And maybe they feel puzzled that somebody wouldn't want to follow that, wouldn't want to have that love, or doesn't feel that biological urge that they felt, you know. So yes, but it's a very those comments are very invasive as well, because my thought always is, you know, when people used to say that to me, I used to think, how do they know that maybe I can't have children, or
Mm-hmm.
maybe I've had 5 miscarriages and I can't face having another one. You know, how do they know there isn't some really tragic reason I don't have children? In my case, it was a happy reason. I wanted a very different kind of life, and I didn't see how kids could fit into that. And I knew I'd be fine without that. But yes, it is. It is really annoying. Now, because of the age I am now, it's the whole, oh, so you don't have grandchildren. And people feeling sorry for me because I don't have grandchildren, and so you don't really escape it. When I was first pitching this book, I talked to an agent in New York, a guy, early 60s, doesn't have children. And he said to me, oh, no, you shouldn't write that book because the gap between you, age gap between you and the women making that decision now is too big and they won't be interested, which was a really awful ageist thing to say. And he was wrong. He was absolutely wrong because it's, things actually haven't changed that much. And there seems to be quite an interest in, well, what is it like to be older and not have children? There's kind of because so many people say you should have children because you'll regret it when you're old, and who's going to look after you when you're old, et cetera, et cetera. And that is something that haunts people because it's just shoved down their throats by society, So, yeah.
I was in a bookstore in like Alabama. It was like a giant used bookstore. And I found this book. I forget what the title was. It was something like, it was a self-help book for dealing with your incredibly disappointing child. It was for parents whose kids had grown up to be like murderers or something.
Oh God. Yeah. Mm-hmm. I mean, yeah, my husband often says to me, we dodged a bullet, because I mean, friends of ours who are now grandparents and have things happening, to their grandchildren and they end up, they're really worried about their grandchildren now, and it's ongoing. And as I have one friend who's always been really honest about what it's like to be a mother. And she had a very difficult time, when the children were little. And now, she's going through it now as a grandmother. And, she said it's people give you the wrong impression, the joys of motherhood, or parenthood. It can be a nightmare. So it's a risk. I think it's one of the biggest risks people can take, actually, which is, again, why I'm amazed that so many people do it without really thinking about it. It's like, it's way more risky than kayaking around Ireland, I think.
And that's just it. And I think that it isn't about risk versus not risk, like we were saying,
Yeah.
in anything. It's more, and I mean, the biggest one that I go to is driving. Nobody stands over the grave of someone who died on their way to get milk, being like the selfishness to deprive their children of a father like, or somebody who works themselves to death. I mean, the lifestyle illnesses associated with just sitting all day. For some reason, we don't code those very, very risky behaviors with like a pathological selfishness where like, yeah, I would argue that driving in a way where you're not acknowledging how dangerous it is incredibly selfish because you might kill someone
Yes.
while you're playing with your phone. But for some reason those don't fall under the category of risk
Well,
taking.
I guess it's because people, well, it depends what, if they have to drive to work or something, or if they have to, whereas nobody has to climb above 8,000 meters, without oxygen, so I mean, I think there is a difference. Not that I'm disagreeing with you, because somebody who drinks and drives, incredibly selfish, might kill other people too. And it's one of those complex questions that there'll never be an answer to it. And I think that's what the conclusion I came to at the end of Where the Mountain Casts Its Shadow. And that's why I then went on to write Explorers of the Infinite, and decided that, and it's kind of annoyed some people who felt that I've given the extreme risk takers an out, by saying it's a search for transcendence. But I do believe that, and I don't think you can condemn people for doing that. You can say, they've got 3 little kids at home. Should they really do that? And I think you can question that, obviously, but you can't deny the drive and the fact that if they don't do those things, if they do stay at home for the sake of the kids, some part of them will die. That's yeah. I'm quite interested in Alex Honnold, who I've met a
Yes.
number of times. He's got 2 children now, and we were on a film jury together in Italy some years ago, and got to know him then. And absolutely gorgeous, lovely guy, But he's now got 2 kids, and how he's navigating all that is interesting.
And it seems too, we've I feel like we started in some of the extremes here, and even just reflecting on mortality and all of that. But there are ways to dial these things back. If you are
Mhm.
someone who free solos and then you start a family,
Yeah,
maybe there are ways to
yeah,
climb that are perfectly safe. I know
exactly.
a guy where he doesn't paddle solo anymore because it doesn't fit the risk profile of where he. And there was I forget her name. She was on Alex Honnold's podcast. She wrote a book about risk. She studies it for a living, and she was talking about how we all have different risk tolerances for different things. And
Hmm.
my tolerance for financial risks is like low. Um, but then job security, I feel freelance ghostwriting is kind of like base jumping, where you
I was going to say you're pretty risky.
yeah, yeah. So I don't know. And I don't think I would have gotten married if I didn't take risks as a hobby, because
Hmm.
if it wasn't for the things I do on the water, the decision to get married would have been the biggest risk I've ever taken, and it
Hmm.
would have been way too scary. It's instead felt like the biggest adventure I've ever had.
Hmm.
You are not adventuring alone these days, and a lot of what you're celebrating in your latest book is that adventuring together. What does that look
Hmm.
like?
Oh, well, it's what I mean, when I was together with Joe Tasker, his whole thing was I wanted to go to base camp. I wanted to trek to the base camp. He wouldn't let me do it because it would disturb his focus. He had to just be totally focused. So I was the one left at home, keeping the home fires burning, etc., which was incredibly frustrating. When I met my husband, he also wanted a really adventurous life, but he said he wanted his partner to be at the center of that, doing everything with him. And it took me a while to get used to that. At first, it seemed a bit weird, because I'd grown used to this extremely, focused, driven man who didn't want me in the adventurous part of his life. So it's been an incredible adventure together. And the thing is, I know that Doug has dialed back things that he would have liked to do because he knew that I just wasn't emotionally or physically capable of doing them. So, and I'm forever grateful that he's been prepared to do that. We've gone on some crazy expeditions together and taken some big risks. But he, I think, would have gone even further. But, sharing that life together has been, yeah, all those dreams I had as a kid of a big, adventurous, exciting life, I've just surpassed all of them. I mean, it's been a life I could never have imagined, and it's ongoing. And I'm hugely grateful to Doug that we've been able to build that together. And we've taken all sorts of risks, like you, financially. We gave up our real jobs, we became freelancers, we traveled the world, we're kind of still doing that even at this age. And yeah, it's just been better than I could have possibly imagined when I was back as a kid wanting to be Alice in Wonderland.
Wonderful. Well, where can listeners find you?
Well, they can read my books. I don't have a personal website, which I should have, but they can look up hiddenplaces.net. And that's about our adventure travel company. And they can find me on Instagram at @bookscoffee and send me a message that way. And I'm on Facebook as well. Yeah, so I love hearing from people reading my books and wanting some dialogue about this crazy kind of life.
Well, Maria, I'm certainly glad I reached out. This has been a great conversation. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you as well. And good luck. Good luck. I'm sure you'll make it. And I look forward to following your progress.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just hoping I don't end up on the operating table this time. If
You won't.
if I don't, it'll be better than last summer.
Well, best of luck. And thank you very much for having me on the podcast. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for being here. If you have an epic story, I'd love to hear it. You can find me at dailyprose.com or on LinkedIn. My links and Maria's are in the show notes. Thanks for listening.